those people that are struggling raising families, this multiplication thing, there's nothing more holy. Right here it's written, be fruitful and multiply. When you build a family, you are doing the most holy thing there is, and it's hard work. So we see that in the rest of Genesis. This family is in crisis, but God still blesses.
If we can lead well at home, we could lead probably just about anywhere. That's where the foundation of leadership is really.
Hey everybody, before we jump into today's episode, we'd like to recognize all those who make this podcast possible. The Lead Today show is supported by all the generous donors of the Lead Today community. Thank you so much for investing in shaping leaders through this podcast. And be sure to like and subscribe on whatever platform you are watching or listening today. All right, let's jump into the podcast.
Well, hello again, everybody. Welcome back to the Today Count Show. I am your host, Jim Piper. And if you are tuning in on a regular basis, you know that specifically you are tuning into the Genesis Project on the Today Count Show. And you know that we normally have, or most often we have, 4 of us guys sitting around make-believe coffee at a coffee shop somewhere, conversing through the biblical book of Genesis. And Gary does have his cup of coffee in his hands. I've got a mini Diet Coke in my available to my left hand over here. But Winston and Matt will not be joining us today. Winston is under the weather and Matt is traveling. So Gary and I will start this off. We are in chapter 9, and chapter 9, I guess, if I were to put a fun title on it, if you could put a fun title on, bad news, I would say Noah, hero to zero, something like that. Those that are more studious would probably call it the second fall of man, being that God just cleaned the slate. He's given us a second chance, and here we are in a pickle again of sin and corruption and consequences of that. So we'll be looking at that here in just a few minutes. We'll be looking at this idea of animals as part of our diet, and that God apparently approves of that way back here in Genesis. And capital punishment is introduced, covenant, and then, of course, this second fall, if you will, and all of the stuff that comes with that. So we got a lot to look at. So I'll just get started, Gary. And I think what I'll do is I'll read verses 1 through, I'm going to say 3. And then we'll pause and I'll see if you have any thoughts, and we'll go from there. Genesis chapter 9, verse 1 says, "And God blessed Noah and his sons, and said to them, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. The fear of you and the dread of you shall be upon every beast of the earth, and upon every bird of the heavens, upon everything that creeps on the ground, and all the fish of the sea. Into your hand they are delivered. Every moving thing that lives shall be food for you. And as I gave you the green plants, I give you everything." I mean, those first 3 verses are already pretty packed.
Yeah, they are. And I know I do get off track, but I kind of point out to our listeners, the Bible repeats things for a reason. And you kind of notice right away that God blessed Noah and then said, be fruitful and multiply. And immediately that just takes you back to the Genesis 1 account, where God says, here's why I'm creating you in the first place. And I find it interesting, having studied leadership development, that there's kind of hidden in here one of the sidebars. It's not the main thing that's being talked about here, but God ordained that the only way we could fulfill our purpose is to multiply. And it's in the multiplication that we can't handle. Adam by himself couldn't stay on the same page with his wife. And then they had two sons, and they couldn't stay. and there's murder. And so here we have sin again emerging, and there's only 7 people,
Right.
right? And but I just point out that what is leadership all about, whether it's in your family or anywhere else, it has to do with this increase in numbers. And it's where there's more than one person, you have trouble staying on the same page. So that's almost a byproduct comment, but he emphasizes it again, like he did in Genesis 1.
Oh, yeah, good point. And in our human weakness, we have a hard enough time taking care of ourselves. And
Yeah.
then, we remember Cain's response when asked where Abel, his brother, was. Am I my brother's keeper? Pushing away all responsibility.
Hmm.
Yeah. So I could, yeah, it's, and, as we've talked about before on this show, uh, we can't contain sin within ourselves.
Hmm.
And when we do decide to love one another, a lot of pain comes with that love. It's not clean. It's just a struggle.
Yeah, absolutely is. Yeah.
It's just a
So we have
struggle.
Yeah, so we're at the beginning of him talking about multiplying again, and already there's trouble in paradise.
Yeah.
So, uh,
Yeah. One of the things that comfort me a little bit is, right from the get go, the Hebrew name they give for God in verse 1 is that same one we talked about early on in Genesis, Elohim, which is the name for God you're going to use when you want to get the relational aspect of God. So that's a little bit comforting that that word is being used, even though you and I know that devastation is coming around the corner here. It's still, a relational God. That helps me that he's not given up on
oh
us.
no, no.
Yeah,
Yeah, sidebar to those people that are struggling raising families, this multiplication thing. There's nothing more holy. Right here, it's written: "Be fruitful and multiply." When you build a family, you are doing the most holy thing there is, and it's hard work. So we see that in the rest of Genesis. This family is in crisis, but God still blesses.
yeah, yeah, Gary, that's good. I mean, uh, it's been said, and I've repeated it in different venues myself. If we can lead well at home, we could lead probably just about anywhere. And I don't know how much of that is hyperbole, but I think what it's trying to say is that's where the foundation of leadership is really learned and established. And God seems to be going right at it. He's not. He's going to just. His purpose isn't changing. He's going to stick. He's going to stick with it. His will be done eventually. So you also see that stubborn side of God's love just coming through here. All right, here we go. And that's how God works with me. I'll make a mistake. I'll sin. I'll get locked in right on an idea, and sometimes it takes a big jar from God for me to see things a different way. But then there's a new beginning. He doesn't keep me there. He, has me get up, dust myself off, and keep going.
Yep, that's right. He's always got his remnant of people and his remnant inside of us. So,
Yeah, yeah.
yeah.
So, what do you make of this part about? It seems to set up a little bit of a controversy where God says, "Look, I've given you these animals to add to be part of your diet." When you look at the context of what has been written, he seems to throw in, "And as I gave you the green plants," meaning you already knew about that. That's what you've been living on. I give you everything. Uh, but weren't they already eating meat? Could we not make a case for that? There was sacrifices. At least Abel gave a sacrifice. Certainly, that wasn't the last sacrifice.
Yeah, the only instruction I remember about eating, of course, was in the garden about the fruit. So it doesn't, it doesn't say, right? It doesn't
Yeah,
explicitly tell us whether we are or not. What I notice here is the fear aspect. That you think about God creating a garden and everything's peaceful and man is aligned with God and creation for a period, and then all of a sudden this this man's given the charter to have dominion and rule everything over everything, but all of a sudden there's now a fear of man between the animals, and you of course see it. I mean, I got crazy cats that live here every day, and they're afraid of me every day, and I'm the one that feeds them. It's just and
Yeah,
so
I guess there's two sides of that maybe. Because when I think about his proposition or his mission uh, to us about being fruitful, multiply, I also think about that other phrase that's often tagged on in older translations and earlier in Genesis, and subdue.
yeah.
And so there is a dominating piece about us, but
Hmm.
to your point, we don't get this idea of the garden being a dangerous place for anybody. So
Hmm.
so mankind and animal kind, it seemed as though peace is implied, but now there isn't
Yeah,
peace.
I agree with that. And
Yeah.
I think, the return to heaven and those sort of things, the implication is that that peace will be restored. And it appears that it's wired in, and the conflict is wired in at this restart.
Yeah, especially if you fast forward to John's vision that ultimately what we think of as heaven, which is probably a temporary holding place, the new heaven and the new earth will descend. And, that tells me it'll mirror to some degree what we've experienced, but without, the sin, the decay, the death.
Well, the
Um,
lamb lays down with the lion, that
right. Yeah.
peace, peacefulness of the creation.
This is
Hmm.
all we know. So it's so hard to imagine what an existence would be like without decay, without harming one another, without threat. With
I've heard from a medical point of view. Now, I mean, again, this is not in scripture, so that some have said, is this the beginning of man shortening their life span by virtue of eating animals and animal
yeah.
fat and those sorts of things? I don't know, but God knows.
No, I think I've heard that too, and I think that's not a far fetched conclusion. I mean, let's remember, Gary, what the preamble was to the flood, that everything was wicked and violent and everything. So to think that we weren't already eating meat would be a ridiculous conclusion.
Yeah, I see what you mean. Yeah.
Right. Especially when we look at the next verse, which says in verse 4, but you shall not eat flesh with its life, that is, its blood. In other words, you could call that rare, and you could also call that alive. And the truth is that missionaries will tell us in different places of the world that humans who act more in savagery would actually kill an animal and eat them right on the spot. And in some cases where the animal's not even deceased yet. And God is obviously saying that that is displeasing to him. So it says, and of course, that's an interesting hinge on the door here, because he uses that to go into his new decree of capital punishment. But I'll start again in verse 4. But you shall not eat flesh with its life, that is, its blood. And for your, it's like that's where the line, he draws the line, but there's a purpose for it, which he's going to spell out here in verse 5. And for your lifeblood, I will require a reckoning from every beast. There's that fear thing you're talking about. Who's going to attack who? From every beast, I will require it. And from man, let's pause there for a minute. So if a lion killed a man, God says, put that lion to death. That's how I read it.
Hmm.
And then it says, from his fellow man, I will require a reckoning for the life of a man. And then here comes the decree: whoever sheds the blood of man, by man shall his blood be shed. And here he gives the reason why. For God made man in his own image. For God made man in his own image. So I'm reading in here, this is the clear decree, the beginning of a justice system of capital punishment. Now, capital punishment, of course, is a controversial statement in cultures around the world, probably regardless where one lives. It's just at different perspectives and temperatures. I guess what I think is interesting here, Gary, we were talking about this before we hit the record button. I did a little bit of research on this phrase, whoever sheds the blood of man. The Hebrew there, I'm going to spell the word in English, is Ratsach. My really rusty, bad Hebrew would call that rasah. In English, I might pronounce it ratsach or ratsach, something like that. But that's the word for murder. So the first phrase is talking about murder. And I'm going to go on a limb here and say, because I know where the book of Deuteronomy is going to go, and Leviticus and such, these books of the law, this is probably referring to first and second degree, certainly first degree murder, perhaps second degree murder. The second phrase, by man shall his blood be shed. In that phrase, the Hebrew word is harag, Harag, which literally means put to death. So one seems to be more of a organized cooperative justice process, and the other one a sin. One seems to be God's ordained direction. And the reason why I say that there was probably, whether it was then or later, learned a constant growing of government and justice is that we know that we were also instructed to erect cities of refuge where criminals could find safety in various levels. What thoughts do you have?
Well, I've always, whenever I think about this passage and capital punishment in general, you find yourself thinking, what does mercy mean? This is a deep topic, and here's what I'm getting at. When God looks at us, does he look at us as individuals or as a race or as a single organism? And I know I get pretty obtuse here, but I find it interesting that God speaks about oneness. And so when Eve was guilty, Adam was guilty. And when a football team loses, the whole team loses. One player drops the ball. And you think, well, that's really not fair that there's judgment here. Like, I will come back to capital punishment, I promise. But it's interesting that it says that we're all from birth corrupt because of the sin of Adam that propagated through the whole race. And you don't really have anything to say about it. In some ways, you think, well, that's not fair. Well, the work of Christ is dependent on this very same principle, because just like it's not fair that I am sinful because of an ancestor, Jesus died for me, and that's not fair either. And so this oneness thing is a big deal. And so when you look at capital punishment, you have to ask yourself, does justly administered capital punishment, not something where you are put to death 30 years later, but where there's clear evidence, is that merciful to society because it prevents hundreds or thousands of other deaths because people learn not to do that? And if you answer, well, no, it's not merciful to the individual, but you look at it from a societal point of view, does it result in more or less death if justice is administered? I'm not answering that question. I'm just posing that God really looks at things sometimes differently than we do, like most of the time. You can argue that really well-administered justice is merciful to the race.
I've got some thoughts on this. I want to say, logically, as I approach the scriptures, God seems to address nations and tribes as the broad direction. But I also believe, based upon, I don't like using the term whim, but he certainly is do his whims, since, as you have pointed out, this is his creation. He's the boss of this creation. When he decides to take Enoch and he decides to take Elijah, obviously he can break his own standards of what is norm. So, a broader geographical, national, and then we read stories about, the Hebrew people that have been captive in Babylon, and you read about the masses, the nameless people, and then you learn about these three Hebrew boys, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and Daniel. And so God tends to make some exceptions by pulling some out of the story. But his coming back to your point, as an engineer, God has engineered his creation so well that he doesn't really need to visit me today in some physical form, whether it be an angel or whatever, a donkey. And I think the other thing, for a contemporary side of our conversation, is I think one of my troubles with capital punishment is that even though we establish what we believe is a just system, or the best system we can, the advancing of DNA has already proven that we have put many to death that were innocent of murder. They were not, yeah, they were not innocent, but they were innocent of the crime that they were charged with and the resulting,
Mm-hmm.
you know, death. But that goes back to fair. Sometimes even in our best efforts, we can't seem to bring justice. We struggle even in the process. Even if we're trying to do it, we struggle with that.
And there's another part of our system I think is not just. Really, I mean, of course, you get it wrong. That's not just. But there's another principle in Ecclesiastes. God says the reason people do evil things is there's a time lapse between when they do it and when they see the consequences. And so to me, the whole purpose of capital punishment, as God described it here, was preventative. He was trying to get behaviors changed, say, don't do this because here's the consequence. Well, I don't know what the average period is between a conviction and a execution of a sentence is, but it's got to be more than 20 years. I've never heard of anybody. You see what I mean? So
Yeah.
we've lost all connection between changing behavior. That's the only justification I can think of biblically for capital punishment, is it actually improves the behavior of society. But it certainly doesn't when there's a delay, because that's what Ecclesiastes says. We don't learn when there's a 30-year delay.
Yeah, and I think we have too many examples of how some have been able to avoid that. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So there's a lot in there. But in spite of our brokenness in civilized nations, at least what we get out of this is that murder is obviously one of the 10 commandments, and to kill something that has been made in the image of God, is here. It's supposed to put the fear of God in us, so to speak. And when we're dealing with one another, I don't think it's too much of a stretch that we're dealing with somebody that God created in his image and in his likeness. And so there should be some radiation of the fear of God into the fear in our relationships with one another.
Well, Jesus really kind of turned this whole thing upside down and made the emphasis not on the murder part, but on the image of God, because he said, basically, if I think wrongly about my neighbor, it's the same as doing it. And so this honoring the image of God is really the main point here, I think.
Yeah, I do too. I do too. It should cause us it should bring humility into our relationships. Yeah, that's really good. We could talk about that more. Maybe we will. Verse 7 says, and you be fruitful, multiply. Here it is again. And on the earth, and multiply in it. And then verse 8 says, then God said to Noah and to his sons with him, behold, I establish my covenant with you and your offspring after you, and with every living creature that is with you, the birds, the livestock, and every beasts of the earth with you, as many as came out of the ark. It is for every beast of the earth. I establish my covenant with you that never again shall all flesh be cut off by the waters of the flood, and never again shall there be a flood to destroy the earth. And God said, This is the sign of the covenant that I make between me and you and every living creature that is with you for all future generations. I have set my bow, rainbow, in the cloud, and it shall be a sign of the covenant between me and the earth. When I bring clouds over the earth and the bow is seen in the clouds, I will remember my covenant that is between me and you and every living creature of all flesh. It seems to be very redundant here. And the waters shall never again become a flood to destroy all flesh. When the bow is in the clouds, I will see it and remember the everlasting covenant between God, referring to himself now in third person, and every living creature of all flesh that is on the earth. God said to Noah, This is the sign of the covenant that I have established between me and all flesh that is on the earth.
Now, this is an unusual passage in that not very often does God put reminders to himself.
Yeah.
Right?
Right.
This he does this rainbow is for him to remember. So that's unusual.
Yeah. I sometimes refer to myself in the third person just for fun. I think what psychologically, what I like about this being pinned this way is it reminds me that as far as we know, we are the only animals, if you will, if I could use that term, that can actually think about ourselves. We can think about our behavior, think about who we want to be, how we want to grow, what we want to accomplish. Whereas in the animal kingdom, as I understand it, it is more response based. It is, and so here, it's like God steps out of himself and he's looking at his creation. He's looking at himself as the creator, the people he created, the rainbow, and he goes, well, God will remember that. I think that is not a stretch to say, and that is the power of vision. If you can start creating a vision for what God would have for you in your life, which is clearly spelled out in scripture, it may not say what trade you pursue, but it really tells you the most important things. You have that vision for the kind of character you want to have, the way you want to treat people, what you want to do with your life. That's a pretty powerful statement. I'm probably reading more into that than I should, but
Yeah, what I hear though, I mean, the thing I take away from you mentioning is this connection about sight and commitment. And here you have, we're back to relationships. Relationships are where things are hard. Making commitments to each other defines relationships. God here is making a commitment. Then he's giving a reminder that he made the commitment. And it reminds you of this ring on your finger.
yes.
The ring's not the important thing. It's the commitment behind it. So I don't know, what an interesting thing going on here, that the creator of the universe is deciding to make a covenant with his creatures. I don't know. He didn't have to do that.
Yeah, I think it reverbs out of he was sorry that he made man, and then he destroyed mankind minus the remnant, and now it's a new beginning. It's almost like the mourning process is coming to an end, and there's a new beginning, even for himself, in the sense of his relationship with mankind. Not trying to lower him down to our level, but I think that's what the scriptures try to do, at least in the sense of understanding that this is a God that we can have a faith relationship with.
Yeah, you talking about that remind me. Somewhere he says, in the part of that lament is man's heart's broken from child up, and it's sort of somewhere in this narrative. I forget where it was, but
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
it's the same idea.
Hey everyone, we're going to take a brief break from the podcast to let you know our very own Jim Piper has released a brand new book called Story, The Art of Learning from Your Past. Everyone has a past, but not everyone learns from it. Jim unpacks lessons in this book that help leaders and learners understand the potential our past has to impact our present and our future. Be sure to grab your copy of Story where books are sold. All right? Let's get back to the podcast.
Yeah.
Uh,
So do you think that, what do you think about that rainbow? This is just for fun. Do you think that rainbow has always been there? And he said, he picked it out, said, I've saved that for this moment. Or do you think because of the scientific theories that it hadn't rained until, well, the Bible says that it didn't rain until, the flood came. And it wasn't just the rain, but also, as you have pointed out, the mass amount of water inside this
in the earth.
ball called the earth, forged up and rained down.
Hmm.
Was
Yeah,
it
so
that?
you could theorize. I
Yeah.
mean, we're in Wonderland here,
Yeah, we
but
are.
the idea, it does say from the tombs of the deep water emerged, and they've already discovered more water under the surface of the earth than above by multiples still. And so one scenario would be all this water came to the surface, then evaporated and truly created the kind of system where a rainbow would be appropriate. Does it say that? No, but that is one scenario.
Yeah, and somebody who's been studying the Bible most of his life, I don't see that conjecture as dangerous. I just think that's interesting to wonder. It is funny though, even to this day, right? You've been with family or friends, and someone will spot the rainbow, and
Mhm.
nobody ignores a rainbow.
No, no,
Isn't that funny? As we go, look at
it
that.
is. It's still remarkable, even after all these
Yeah, yeah,
all these years.
yeah.
Um,
Even
yeah.
the little ones that you see that are fabricated poolside, and then the big ones in the sky. I mean, you see them all over. Um, Kind of like a kaleidoscope, that is there. When I think about the greatness of God, I think about the elements of His creation that I cannot see beyond a microscope. That the microscope gets me to a certain size, but not smaller. Even as we continue to develop microscopes that can get smaller and smaller, there's still more. There's still more. And then the telescope, even though we continue to develop telescopes to go out farther, we can't seem to keep, there's more. There's more. And kind of like what we talked about last time, how do you describe that kind of a God with the limits that we have in language? Um, it's just hard to describe. So we're not critics of the text or the narrative. What we're doing is going, is that what we're trying to say? Is that what he's trying? Is
Mhm. Yeah,
we
we're
go,
limited.
yeah.
Yeah.
Well, and
Yeah.
then we get to this point, Gary, where as I started in the beginning, call it hero to zero, call it the second fall of man. But this is a bummer, and I'll go ahead and dive in. And this one's going to take a little bit of dissecting. You should see my Bible right now, Gary. I got arrows pointing here and there, and
Yeah.
names underlined and question marks. But because first blush, I'm going, was it really that big of a deal? Um, and then the more you think about it, oh, okay, yeah. So it says, verse 18, the sons of Noah who went forth from the ark were Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Ham was the father of Canaan. Now, once we read further, we know why that's put in parentheses. In other words, here comes. It's almost like remember these names. So I'm going to read it again. The sons of Noah who went forth from the ark were Shem, Ham, and Japheth. And then in parentheses, it says Ham was the father of Canaan. Verse 19, these three were the sons of Noah, and from these the people of the whole earth were dispersed. That's important. Then in verse 20, it says, Noah began to be a man of the soil, and he planted a vineyard. He drank of the wine and became drunk and lay uncovered in his tent. Let me pause there for a minute, and you can jump in too if you want before I continue. So we know now that this isn't like the day after they got out of the ark, because the boys already have boys and a vineyard has grown.
Mm-hmm.
So we can't say what I first ran to Noah's defense. I remember this when I first read this many years ago. Well, he probably didn't know. He didn't know that stuff was going to, knock him on his can. Always trying to stick up for the guy.
Yeah, right.
Right. So I think some years has passed here, and I mean probably decades. Probably decades because of what we're going to learn here. Okay, so he drank of the wine and became drunk. This is verse 21. He drank of the wine and became drunk and lay uncovered in his tent, meaning naked, I suppose. And Ham, the father of Canaan, they're repeating that, saw the nakedness of his father and told his two brothers outside. Okay, so we've got some gossip going on here, some spreading of shame, some shaming, maybe laughter, maybe whatever form.
Ridicule, yeah, could be.
Yeah. Then Shem and Japheth took a garment, laid it on both their shoulders, and walked back into the tent. I'm adding that, and walked backward and covered the nakedness of their father. Their faces were turned backward, and they did not see their father's nakedness. When Noah awoke from his wine and knew what his youngest son had done to him, I just want to pause there and say, youngest son. I don't believe this is referring to the youngest of Shem, Ham, and Japheth. I think this is referring, this would not be unusual for biblical text for a son to be a grandson or even a great grandson, frankly, of a patriarch or a father. We'll often see he's the son of so and so and so and so. So when Noah awoke from his wine and knew what his youngest son had done to him, I'm going to suggest that is Canaan. He said, "Cursed be Canaan. A servant of servants shall he be to his brothers." He also said, "Blessed be the Lord, the God of Shem, and let Canaan be his servant. May God enlarge Japheth, and let him dwell in the tents of Shem, and let Canaan be his servant." After the flood, Noah lived 350 years, and all the days of Noah were 950 years, and he died. Your turn, Gary.
Yeah. Well, there's a lot of probably not very many passages that have been interpreted and reinterpreted and trying to figure out what this means other than what it says. So one of the things I've certainly heard is that uncovering the phrase "uncovering his nakedness" is used in other places to reference sexual related activity, or has sexual connotations, but I don't know. But the size of the punishment makes you think something pretty significant is going on here. But I don't know.
Yeah, I don't disagree with that, and I haven't dived into this at a PhD level, right? I mean, I've done some study on it, of course, and I have probably even taught on this. in years gone by from the pulpit. But it does seem, if my facts are straight, Canaan would be Ham's fourth son. And I get that out of the next chapter in verse 6, where it says, the sons of Ham, and then he puts them in order: Cush, Egypt, Put, and Canaan. And then they talk about grandsons, daughters and grandsons after that. And so that appears to me to be pretty clearly, first of all, Canaan. And then, of course, the curse comes out not against his father, but against Canaan. But, if you think about it, if your son is cursed, you're cursed, right? I mean, you're at least cursed in your heart, pierced in your heart. And then I think that not only the language, the linguistics that you discussed, that you just mentioned, Gary, but also the history. So you discussed that linguistically, it suggests some sort of sexual impropriety, that when Canaan went into Noah's tent, something occurred there while he was, knocked out drunk. But when you follow the lineage of Canaan into the Canaanites, they were known as a very perverse tribe in the arena of sexuality. Not to say every person was, stricken with it, but it was a epidemic, let's just say. And then, of course, as we know, became enemies of Israel as time goes on, which we will see. We'll get to see some of that down the road. But then what kind of helps, I think, establish that is Shem, one of the brothers. Again, we go back, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. So Shem, one of Ham's brothers, that is the lineage for Jesus. And then, so that would obviously be the earmark for that clan. And then Japheth seems to be the tribe, if I can call it tribe, that began to spread into the Western European world. So they all seem to, at least broadly, follow this cursing and blessing of Noah, and gives a little more evidence, maybe, to, I think you're right.
Is it, of course, God does nothing by accident, but you wonder whether this is a type of Christ. It mentions Shem first and then Japheth, and that they backed up and covered up. And you think what Jesus does for us, he covers our sin. And, it's just fascinating that Shem's name's used first, and that's where the line of Jesus comes.
Well, yeah, I think that brings up a good question. People often ask us, don't they, Gary, what happened to the people before Jesus? If the Bible teaches that Jesus is the way, the truth, and the life, then how did people from ancient days, how do they go to paradise? How do they go to heaven? And our answer from Scripture tells us that when they followed the direction of the priests and the Hebrew people, the teachings of God, and the sacrifice of, whether it be a bird or a large animal, depending upon their economic ability, they were doing that in faith, and it was known to be a covering for sin, not a once and for all, idea. So again, whether we're taking that too far or not, that is continuing the story. Well, actually, it's paralleling with the story of a covering until Jesus becomes, the final lamb that is shed, for us. And obviously, what is discouraging, and you said this earlier about multiplying. Here we have this fresh family. We don't know if they've been on, we don't know whether they have been on dry ground now for 20 years, 50 years. We don't know. But obviously, Canaan had to be of an age where he could commit such a sin. So whatever, whatever that is. And so, and just that short amount of time, we would shame our father and we would gossip about our father. And obviously, not even within the, oh my gosh, what should we do, brothers? But it's inferred pretty clearly that probably the whole camp knew. It's spread. It doesn't say that, but how did Canaan find out? It doesn't say that he mistakenly walked in. Um, I'm assuming he got the information and out of curiosity, and then curiosity is good and bad. It leads you in good places, leads you in bad places. Then that last verse was kind of fun. You and I talked about this too before we got it onto hit record. We, in doing the math, commentators have said in these last two verses, after the flood, Noah lived 350 years. All the days of Noah were 950 years, and he died. And so we know Noah to be one of the heroes of the faith, but we also know Abraham to be heroes of the faith. And from a world religion perspective, often called the father of the main religions, Muslims, Judaism, and Christianity. So the vast majority of the world has certainly heard of Abraham. And so
I remember seeing that timeline too somewhere, and it
Yeah.
it just kind of bends your mind to think the Tower of Babel story and Abraham, that Noah was still alive by, what did
Yeah.
you say, 50 years or so?
Yeah. One of the commentaries laid out the math and suggested this, that Abram was born, his original name Abram before it was changed to Abraham. Abram was born 292 years after the flood, which the math would say that allowed for 58 years where Abram and Noah were on the planet at the same
Hmm.
same time. But you said that you read something in the rabbinic teachings that they might even have bumped into each other at the grocery store,
Mhm.
or known each
Uh,
other
uh,
from a
yeah, there, the rabbinical history, or what some of the sources they use, I'm not deeply familiar with, but one one teaching I heard was that Abraham intentionally went to visit Noah and spent time with him. And Abraham grew up in a very sinful place, dominated by the charismatic leadership of that resulted in the Tower of Babel and all that. So, it's one theory that Noah's influenced Abraham's development that might have been a seed of that faith. But it's not recorded in Scripture.
Gary. Before we close the pages on chapter 9, what are some of your main takeaways? Main takeaway, singular or plural?
I find one of my bigger takeaways of all the Old Testament in that it's encapsulated here. I mean, we see the fallenness of man. We're sick. Was it in Good to Great? The one of the fundamental truths in that great leadership book was face the brutal facts. Yeah, and then out of those facts, you then can make an intelligent plan. Well, the brutal facts are reinforced here that within one generation that they're corrupt again. And Adam and Eve, they got to two people and they were corrupt. And so for all of us, there's this sort of reality, the depressing part, that we there's something broken deeply inside of us, whether you call it genetic or whatever. We have a disease. But the good news is God just delivered him, and he has a rescue for us. He covers our sin. We don't see it all unfold, but the whole Old Testament is just such evidence that nothing works except Jesus. Nothing ever worked. Even all the good kings, there's a litany of all the kings coming up here if we ever get through all those. And most of them are labeled bad kings, but even the good ones, David didn't finish that well. Solomon was a train wreck. And so, you asked my takeaways. You see in here the mercy of God and our need for a Savior, and you see it in this story of Noah.
Yeah, I share a lot of that with you. The thing we haven't talked about is, we can't take Noah off the hook. And w- would any of this happened if he hadn't sinned? But to your point,
Mhm.
it's awfully hard to judge another man when I know that I'm a man. And then I just see God busily making his covenants that he always keeps, regardless of whether we, keep ours. He just keeps pursuing us, just continues to pursue us. And it'll be interesting to see how these three sons turn into nations as we continue to see the story progress. Gary, good seeing you. You look good. And
Yeah.
I look forward to Genesis chapter 10.
Yeah.
That one is going to be a little interesting as well. But once we get through 10, then we go to the Tower of Babel and we come to that intersection somewhere. Maybe we'll meet Abraham and Noah in the grocery store. We'll see what happens.
We'll see what happens. Well, thanks a lot for leading us. This is always interesting and engaging and exciting.
Thanks for joining us today.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Thank you for joining us here at the Today Count Show. Be sure to like and subscribe on whatever platform you listen or watch so you don't miss any content. And stay tuned for more coming soon.